And hello everyone, welcome back to another Love2D tutorial. So in the previous tutorial, we added the game state. In this tutorial, we will be adding text to the game now that we have the state implemented. So what we have currently is something like this. So where we go like this, and we can also pause like that. Pausing isn't perfect, but you get the idea. Now, when we pause, I want the user to actually be able to see that they paused, because let's say they accidentally press the escape button and suddenly their game stops working. They will think it's a bug, but in fact the game is being paused. So, we're going to implement that. And here's an example. Let me just bring this over here. So let's go like this and then pause. As you can see, there's no paused text on the screen. And now we go like this. It's nice. Cool. So that's an example of what we'll be doing. Now let's get started. So we already have a states folder. Let's create a new folder for components. And this folder will be used specifically for components that we might want to use in the game. We'll also create another folder, and this one will be for objects. Now, the states contains the states, is the menu, game, those types of states. The objects will contain objects that we can touch, so the player is an object. And in the components is basically like the text. It's not necessarily an object that we can crash into with the player or something like that. So yeah, now with the player, we can move the player to objects. There we go, move. Then here we want to say objects player, since now the player is in the objects folder. We don't actually use the player here, so we don't have to worry about it there. If we run the game, everything should still work fine. Cool. Then the components, we can create a new file called text.lua because it's text. We include this main.lua, and now we can start working on the text. So first let's local love is equal to require and just love. Then we can create a function, call it text. It will take in some data and then it will return something. Of course, a table. And then at the end, we can just say return text. There we go. Our basic text object setup. Now we need to think of properties that text may have. So let's actually split it up into a few things here. Let's go parameters. Now first, I think all text will have some text, which would be of like a string or a text type that will be displayed. And this text will be the text to be displayed. And it's required. Now, you might ask, why am I doing this? Like, what does this benefit us with? If I were to hover over my text, you'll notice now we have parameters. Text, string. Text to be displayed required. This is called documenting your code. So if someone else in the future comes back to our code here, they will be able to just hover over a function wherever we use it and see what it needs. So that's what I'm doing here. If this wasn't here, then as you can see, we don't get any description. So that's what I'm doing here. Now, this is quite a lot of we're going to have to type. So since I'm too lazy, I'm just going to paste this from the already existing script code. There we go. We need an X for the X position of the text, so from the side of the screen. A Y for the Y position of the text from the top of the screen. All of these are as far required. We also then want from here everything's optional. But we also want the font size. The default will be P, and I'll set up this in a second where we'll actually have some default versions. If you know HTML, then this will help you greatly. And here are some of the options we can use. We then have a fade in, which will allow us to fade in the text. So let's say if it's a game over, we want the text to fade in as well as the text to fade out. This is just a boolean, so true or false if it should fade in and or fade out. Wrap with, this is when the text should be broken. So this should be when should the text break. The default would be the window width, but you can change this and you'll see later where we can change this. Then there's the align. So where will the text be aligned on the screen? It's like center, left, right, all of that. And then the opacity. Basically, this will allow us to set a default opacity for the text. So the text should maybe be a little bit see-through or something along those lines. We can now implement that in here. So we want the text, the X, the Y, the font size, the fade in, fade out, wrap width, align, and opacity. Quite a lot. You don't need all of this, but I feel like giving as much choice as possible is always a good idea. Now here above return, we can set some of the default values. So you can also do this in return if you want to, but most of this will be useful outside of it. So font size is equal to the font size that has been passed in, or it will default to P for paragraph, so paragraph size. We can then just create a space and copy 5 times. We then want fade in, fade out, so fade in, fade out, wrap with, align, and opacity. So all of these. So every one that's optional. Then we want to replace all of these with those values. And of course these as well. And in the fade in would by default be false. This will be false. This wrap with will be love.graphics.getWidth. The line would be defaulted to left. So right here on the screen, you can make it center so it's in the center, or you can make it right so it's on the right. And then the opacity here will default to 1. Now we also want to set some constants. First, we can start with the text fade duration, because we won't use the fade just yet. But doing all of the setup beforehand will save us a lot of time in the future. But you don't have to do it right now, but I do recommend you still do it right now if possible. Local text, and this is going to be a constant, so it will be all caps. Fade for text fade duration. We'll make that to 5. Now we have the problem here of this right here. How will we set that? Now we can do that by creating something that can hold all of that. So local fonts, and here we can specify the fonts we want. For example, H1 will be the size of love.graphics.newFont, and we can make it something like 60 for like 60 pixels. We can then copy that 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times. Then here we can just go H1 to H2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and make this P. You can add more. You can also use a different structure. I just think that, to me at least, this makes sense since I use HTML. And in HTML, H1 is the biggest text you can have, unless you modify it with CSS. But it's the biggest text you can have. And in P is like regular small text, just regular text. P is also about 16 pixels. And in H6 is usually smaller than P. H5, H4, H3, H2, and then H1. There we go. So there's all of our text sizes. We won't use all of them, but they exist if we need the variety from them. You can also give them different names if that's what you're into. We also want to set if fade in. So if we try to fade in, then you want to give the default opacity actually a lower value. Because if we want to fade in, then the default opacity should be pretty low. Since we want it to fade in, if the default opacity is 1, it's not going to fade in, it's going to pop in. So opacity then gets overwritten to 0.1. So no matter what they put in here, if we say it's fade in, then we're going to force it to fade in by making the opacity 0.1. Cool. We have now done all of this setup, so let's use what we have here. First, we can go and say text is equal to the text that was passed in. X, oh, not dot love. X is equal to the X. Y is equal to the Y. And opacity is equal to the opacity. Now, whilst I could put all of this inside of here as well, currently I don't think I'm going to use any of this outside of this text. So I'm going to keep it here since I'm not using it outside of this text. But if I do, I can move this, for example, the opacity that I moved here, I can move it to down here, because what's in return is things we can use outside of this right here. So we can't use this or this outside of this text function. However, we can use all of this outside of the text function. Now we can also set our default colors for the text. So colors is equal to R, which will be 1, meaning basically full red, G, which will be 1, and then B, which will be 1. So red, green, blue. And since they're all 1, this also means that by default they are white. So the text will be white on the very dark black background. Now we want to also be able to set these colors at any point, and you could move these colors here if you don't think you use them outside of this text function. But here we could go set color equal to, and we can create a function. This function will take in self, red, scroll down, green, and blue. Then here we can say self.colors.r is equal to red, self.colors.green is equal to green, self.colors.blue is equal to blue. So now if we use the set color, it will set the color to whatever we pass in. So we don't have to type this out every time we want to set the color. And now for the last function that we'll implement, and then we'll wait a while before we try anything else, is the draw function, because we still need to draw the text to the screen. That's a function. Function takes in self, and now we basically need to say what text we want. I'm going to call this TBL text, because the text will later be stored inside of a table, and also index. And this table is what we're also going to pass in here with the index of what we want to use. You'll understand this in a second once we use it. We can then go if self.opacity is more than 0. They want to do a bunch of things. Else, if the opacity is not more than 0, then we want to say table.remove. And we want to remove from TBL text the item at that index. That should be T. Basically, this is for our fading stuff. So once it fades out, we want to remove it from the table, because if it's still in the table, let's say after 2 hours of playing the game, that means everything that was text is still in the table 2 hours later. And every table requires RAM, and the more RAM you use, the worse the game will perform. So if the user plays the game for, let's say, 10 hours, then by hour 10, their game will probably reach like 5 FPS or something. But yeah, and we can just return false, because that means there's nothing left to draw. Otherwise, we can return true, because there's still stuff left to draw. Okay, now here we can start with the drawing things. We can leave the fading stuff for later. So let's first go love.graphics.set color, and here we can say self.colors.r, as will give us red, self.colors.green, and then self.colors.blue, and of course self.opacity. And this will set the color of the text we currently want to draw. Then we want to set the font of the text we want to draw. So love.graphics.set font, and then we can pass in fonts, and then at the font size. So the font size we can find right here, which would be something like P or H1, and we pass that in here to get the font size. We'll play a little bit with this to kind of get the idea of what it does. Then we want to say love.graphics.printf, specifically printf because of how much it allows us to modify, how much we can like just do things our way, like customization. So first we want to specify the text as self.text, and then self.x for the x position, self.y for the y position, the wrap width, and then the align. So as I said, you don't have to make a lot of these things you need to pass in. That's why they're optional. You could just hard code them in here, but I wanted to make it more robust. I think that's the word. Then also, after we have done all of this, we want to change the font size back to P, so we have a standard font size everywhere. Now that we have this, I think we can try it out. And then once we have tried it out, we can implement the fade in and fade out. We won't use it yet, but we'll implement it. So let's go here inside of game, and let's create a draw function inside of the game. Draw is equal to a function, self, and also faded. I'll explain that in a second. So first we can say if faded, then text, and this text is what we need to import. So we can actually just go here to main, copy this import, go here, paste it, but now we can say text, and text comes from components / text, and we should just say dot dot and then a slash to specify go back one directory, so one folder. Since we're here, we want to go back one folder and then jump into the components folder. That's what this means. Those two dots means go back one folder. Also, we can just say local love is equal to require love. So yet again, it's not required to specify this. It's just optional, but I like specifying it anyways. And then down here, we can say text, and we can pass in a bunch of things. If we hover over text, then unfortunately we don't get any of the documentation we wrote. This probably still needs to import all of that, but for now it's fine. So the text we want to display is going to be paused. Then we can say 0, and that will be for the X, and then love.graphics, scroll down a bit, .get height, and we can just say times 0.4, and this will kind of position the height in the center of the screen. We don't say 0.5 because you should remember that the very top of the text is actually where the text gets drawn. So if we put it at 0.5, it's actually going to be drawn underneath the halfway mark instead of in the middle of it. Here we can specify the size, for example, H1. We can specify false and false for the fading, and then love.graphics.get width, and this is for the word wrapping, and then where to align it to, and in this scenario, center. If we run this, or if we not run this, but we then can go and say draw. Now if we run it, we won't get anything, because we need to actually now use this draw inside of main. So down here, if we scroll, we have a player.draw. But now we can actually use our states to our advantage. So we can say if game.state.running, or if the game.state.pause. So if it's one of these two states, we want to draw the player, as well as game draw, game.state.paused. So we are passing in this game.state.paused. The reason for it is because game.state.paused is a true or false value. So currently, if we go here, then we are trying to get a true or false value. So if it's true, then draw this. If it's false, don't draw this. We'll expand on this more later, but for now, this is fine. Alright, so now we're saying draw, and it will basically execute this right here. And if the game state is not paused, it will not draw anything inside of here because faded will not allow it to. It's faded because we're going to change it later. But yeah, for right now, we can just say love dot and see if it works. Okay, now let's go and pause. And there we go, we get paused. Isn't that absolutely amazing? So that's pretty cool. Let's make the text a bit smaller. Let's go, instead of H1, we say P. If we run that, then the text is now super small. So we made it able to change the text size by literally just changing one line. So change that back to H1 to make it nice and big. Now, this is more for the future. Currently, it won't benefit us a lot to type this. However, in the future, it will definitely benefit us to have this. So let's go here underneath opacity and say if fade in, so if we should fade in, do something. Else if fade out, so if we should fade out, then, because we don't want them to both happen at the same time, so we're using an if-else statement. So if fade in, then we first do fade in, and then we can change fade in to false, and then do fade out, because we don't want two different if statements. You want one if statement that just has an else if. So if we want to fade in, then we'll fade in, but it won't try and fade out at the same time. Then we can go self.opacity is equal to self.opacity minus, and here you can't say 1. 1 is a little big though, because our opacity is a range of 0 to 1. So by saying -1, we'll immediately go from seeing text to not seeing text. So we can divide that by text fade duration. So there's 5 right here. So depending on how much you make this, the text will fade slower. And in here we can also just divide it by love.timer.get FPS. There we go. And this will nicely fade it for us. So it looks nice once it fades out. We're not going to use it in this tutorial, but we will use it in the future. Then here in the fade in, we can check the opacity, because if the opacity is more than 1, that means we have faded in. So we now want to fade out if possible. So we can check if self.opacity is less than 1. So only if it's less than 1, then increase the opacity. Else, if it's not less than 1, that means it's more than 1. Then we want to set fade in equal to false. Now that we have set fade in to false here, that means fade in will be false, so this will not be triggered. So if fade out is true, then we'll fade out the text. Then here we can say self.opacity, and it will actually just be the same thing. So let's just copy that. But this time, instead of minus, it will be plus. And now we have implemented fade out and fade in. Cool. Now we have added the text, and we can use this text in a lot of the parts of the game. In the next tutorial, we'll be adding asteroids. That's actually what the game is about. So definitely stay tuned, because that is a very important part of this tutorial. Thank you all for watching. I hope you all enjoyed, and I will see you all again in the next Love2D tutorial.